Hello. Thank you for participating in the inaugural MERC 2.0 online session. The title of this session is Formulating Research Questions and Designing Studies. There are 5 online sections, each lasting about 7 to 10 minutes. And in between the sections, there are exercises for you to do and work to post online. At the end of the 5th section, there is also a brief evaluation we hope you will complete. A worksheet is provided for your use, and we suggest that you print it now before we begin. We'd like to start by recognizing past and present MERC team members who have contributed to this session. So let's get started. There are 4 objectives to this session. They are: write a finer research question, develop the steps in the research process, select the correct or optimal design for your research question, and consider your needs for IRB approval, analyzing your data, and dissemination. As we move through the workshop, we will talk about moving from general issues or topics that interest you to specific research questions, touching on using the literature to define and refine your question, measuring the variables, and selecting the optimal research design. This figure in slide 6 gives an overview of the entire process. Let me start by noting that although it is depicted as a linear process, it rarely goes that way. It can be, and often is, iterative, moving back and forth among a few steps. It starts with defining your research question. And how do you do that? For many of us, it starts with looking around our workspace and seeing things that puzzle, fascinate, or maybe frustrate us. Let's start with your first activity. Go to the worksheet and list as many research questions as you can under question 1, the first page. I will pause for about 2 to 3 minutes. Okay, how was that? Now take a look at your questions and mark the one that is most interesting to you and seems feasible. Note I mentioned interesting first. If it isn't interesting to you at the outset, it surely won't be at the end. Now, mark your best or your favorite overall question and write it under Entry 2 on your worksheet. And if you feel the need, rewrite it at least once more in number 3 and maybe number 4. Remember, the goal is a finer research question. Place some checks on your worksheet to represent the strong points of your question. Let's step back and think about what makes a good question. There are 6 features that are often considered. Not all 6 features will be relevant to all research questions, but we find the list useful. almost as a checklist to evaluate your research question. First, many would say that your question should be based on theory or literature. The model or theory or framework that drives your thinking won't always be apparent in the actual question, but it will be useful as you develop your project. For example, you might be using adult learning theory as your backdrop. Consequently, you might ask faculty who are actively involved in improving interprofessional education teaching skills via role-playing and team learning score higher on a tool of IPE attitudes compared to faculty who do solitary reading. Second, the question should suggest who you are studying. Third, a strong question will suggest the design. For example, are you looking at change within a group or differences between two or more groups? Fourth, if you have independent and dependent variables, the reader should be able to detect what they are. What influences the outcome? I will say more about this later. Fifth, the variables you suggest will ultimately need to be measurable. Do you have a plan for that? And finally, depending on who you're writing for, the question might be stated as a question or as a hypothesis, maybe even a formal null hypothesis. This concludes part 1. Welcome back. Let's work more on our questions. Now we are getting to the nuts and bolts of defining variables. In this section, we're going to talk about definitions or consider examples for the terms listed here: variable, independent and dependent variables, covariates, operationalization, and sample and population. I'm guessing these terms look familiar to you. In simple terms, a variable is something you study that has the capacity to change. For example, grades or scores or attitudes or confidence. Make sense? But it won't always change. There are static variables like race and ethnicity that might also be a part of your question. They have different values for different people. Your question might also have independent and dependent variables. Dependent variables are the variables that change in response to the independent variables. For example, using an online preparation course versus self-study might influence grades on a final exam. In this example, the type of preparation one does, self-study versus an online course, is the independent variable, and grades are the dependent variables. Third are covariates. These are all of the things that might also influence your dependent variable or outcome of interest. For example, past experience, number of hours studying, confidence, and interest. Fourth, operationalization and measurement have to do with exactly how you will measure your variables. This is the topic of section 3. But as a preview, say you're interested in studying burnout. In your question, you might just say burnout. For example, burnout among third-year residents will decrease after a 6-hour skills-based intervention. But you may be more specific and operationalize it by stating the instrument. Burnout among third-year residents, as measured by the Mazak Burnout Inventory, will decrease after a 6-hour skills-based intervention. Finally, you will need to note the sample, as I just did with third-year residents, and be thoughtful in your project regarding how the sample generalizes to the population. Stay tuned for more on this one. So that was a lot of words for what is quite often straightforward. Let's put our knowledge to test with 2 examples. Here's the research question. Does training in airway management on a simulator improve resident performance compared with standard didactic or demonstration instruction? Okay, so now let's consider these questions. What is the independent variable? What is the dependent variable? What are the possible covariates? What is the population and sample? And what is your design? I will give you about a minute to think about your answers to these, and then we can discuss. Okay, for the independent variable, who noted it was simulator versus usual didactic simulation and training outcomes? That's what's being manipulated here. Moving on to the dependent variable, we can see that several were listed: correct selection of equipment, number of errors, and time to intubation. What are some covariates or covariables that we should be thinking about? Maybe prior experience, maybe the specialty that the residents are in. What else? Okay, for sample, the question said residents. What do we think about that? What kind of residents were they? Emergency medicine or anesthesia? How about what level? Were they all PGY1s or residents of all levels? This is one area where there's room for improvement in this particular research question. And then for design, it's not really clear here what kind of a design we're thinking of. Do we have a trial with an intervention and a comparison group, or is it a pre-post design where we have one group of residents and we're looking at how they do before and after, maybe a simulation intervention? We would have to read the rest of the plan or proposal to get the details. But consider revising the question to this: performance by PGY1 anesthesia residents on an airway management simulation exercise will be superior compared to performance by historical controls with standard didactic demonstration instruction. So let's try another one. Do first-year medical students who complete a student-run anatomy review course score higher on the anatomy final than students who did not complete the review course? Take a minute to consider these questions. What is the independent variable? I'm guessing many of you said doing or completing the student-run course. Ultimately, as we will talk about in the next section, we need to define complete. What if there were 6 sessions, each 1 hour? Does complete mean attend all 6 sessions for 60 minutes? Does it mean sign in and then leave? Are those who did 5 sessions treated the same as those who did none or only 1 or 2? What is the dependent variable? That's easier, right? The grade on the anatomy final exam. And what are some possible control variables? Maybe prior knowledge, prior grades. What else? Okay, and what is a sample? First-year medical students. That's great. But what else might we want to know? Are they volunteers? First come, first serve? And what about the design? It seems like it's some sort of comparison between groups. We can return to this in section 4 when we talk about design. So let's expand a little bit on defining the sample and population. Note that in the first example we moved from resident to PGY1 anesthesia residents. I added specificity to the sample. But there are other things you need to think about as you write your question and plan your study. One is, who is your target population? That is, who is the group that you ultimately want to generalize to? All PGY1 anesthesia residents? All PGY residents who learn airway management? all PGY1 anesthesia residents at similar institutions. There is no right or wrong answer, but if you think about sample and population up front, it will help you craft a better question and design a sound study. So ask yourself, who is your target population? All residents in all specialties who learn airway management? But wait, who do you actually have access to? Did the emergency medicine program director really agree to this? Ultimately, you find this balance between who you wish you could generalize to and who you're actually going to have access to. Maybe you need to back up a little bit. You really wanted to generalize to all residents who learn airway management, but that's not possible right now anyway. So you just start with anesthesia. Then you ask, what are your inclusion and exclusion criteria? These need to be stated very specifically. Often in education, we really don't have exclusion criteria. We're happy to take all takers, but we still need to state it specifically. And along with this, we need to think about your time and the subject's time frame. What will be their willingness to actually participate in your study? Is this something that's on an elective? And do all residents still have elective time in this academic year? When in the academic year are you planning to do your study and collect your data? That could influence who is in your sample and ultimately your target population. And in the end, who will actually show up and be in your study. So this is the end of section 2. We want you to go to your worksheet now and answer questions 6 to 10. Think about having really clear words, concepts, and plans. So now we're back for section 3, operationalization. Welcome back. How did that exercise go? Consider these questions and critique your question. Was it clearly stated? Was it stated as a question? Does it seem testable? Did you name and define your variables that you want to study? And did you name and define your sample that you expect to be studied? Let's move on with a return to the research process. What we've done so far is the first step. That's okay, it's the most important. Now you have a good question with a lot of specificity. We'll take a second and remind you to integrate your work and evolving ideas and questions with the literature review. What may happen is that you find your question has already been answered, so you return to the beginning and you write a new question. More often than not, you learn through reading similar work a few important tweaks that can be made to your question. Here we list some sources for you to consider. I find review articles and reference sections of closely related projects to be most useful. A lot of the benefit of reading the literature is in 2 areas: locating and refining theoretical and conceptual models, and seeing how others with similar interests have operationalized their variables. But most certainly, after you review the literature, you will refine your questions. So let's get to the meat of section 3, operationalization. What this basically means is that we answer, or at least think about answering, 3 questions. What do you measure? How do you measure? And how well do you measure? Operationalization and measurement are among the most challenging steps in the medical education research process. Indeed, a substantial part of the medical education literature is focused on identifying, describing, and refining procedures for measuring educational variables. That is, how to operationalize and measure constructs and variables such as professionalism, performance, knowledge, preferences, and confidence. The what is pretty easy. The variables or outcomes that you measure obviously need to be guided by the study hypothesis or questions, and this includes both the independent and dependent variables. The how of measurement is often the most challenging. Frequently, researchers fall back on existing measures or data, even if they don't precisely measure the construct or thing that you care about, because of the work and challenge of creating new measures. Measurement means operationalizing the underlying dimension or construct about which you are concerned into some form of observable behaviors or events. Specific measurement decisions and choices frequently fall into one of three categories. You can count events, such as website hits or correct answers to test questions. You can measure physical quantities, such as time spent in an activity, like sleeping or using an online module. Third, you can have study participants translate their internal state, events, or processes into something external and quantifiable. Common examples of this are the ubiquitous 5-point Likert scales, which require students to translate, say, their positive or negative attitudes towards a course into a number. Faculty ratings of clinical performance are another common measurement activity. Most educational outcomes that are used in research studies can be categorized into one of three domains, each with different measurement methods. Knowledge is often assessed by test using various existing or maybe homemade tests. Attitudes and values are typically measured through questionnaires and surveys. And performance is measured in a variety of ways depending on the outcomes, but common examples are the objective structured clinical exam, standardized patient interactions, and direct observation of learner performance on a task. Performance can also be inferred from documents such as electronic health records, patient notes, and even directed reflections. The boundaries among these three domains are not airtight, of course. Knowledge and performance, for example, often blend together since we are frequently interested in performance that demonstrates the application of knowledge. Similarly, attitudes and knowledge interact. Measuring one sometimes requires measuring the other as well. Here's the third question. How well do you measure? Even after you make the decisions about what to measure and how to measure it, you need to pay attention to how well those measurements are working. In a sense, this is the quality control aspect of measurement, and it can be summarized in the two concepts of reliability and validity. These terms apply to all forms of measurement, not just knowledge tests. Reliability is focused on consistency, stability, and reproducibility of scores or measurements. For whatever you are measuring, will the way you are measuring it produce the same result if you could replicate the conditions? Specifically, if you are using a test or questionnaire, would a repeat application produce the same data? Or, if you are using observers, would one observer agree with the ratings or data produced by another rater observing the exact same events? Or, if you are doing observations, would different observers seeing the same thing agree on their score or rating? Validity is focused on the meaning of a score or the data produced by the measurement. Does your measurement really measure what you want it to? For example, USMLE scores are widely accepted as a valid measure of medical knowledge, but research suggests that they are not very meaningful or valid measures of what the student can or does do in an actual clinical situation. There's a whole MERC workshop on reliability and validity, so we won't say more here, but keep these ideas in the back of your mind as you design your study. How can I measure my key variables, and how well can I do it? Okay, this is the end of section 3. Go back to your worksheet and answer questions 11 and 12. Okay, in this section we'll talk about study design. What we mean by design is the general plan for how and when you will be collecting data to answer your study questions. I will take you through a few slides on design options. For research questions for which there is little literature, exploratory qualitative methods may be most useful. Qualitative methods tend to be used when we want to focus on meaning and context, and we are not too interested in counting. We tend to ask why or how questions. Often it is a newer area of study, and qualitative studies tend to focus on interpretation. Common methods are interviews, focus groups, and observational studies. Reflections and open-ended portions of surveys may also provide the data for qualitative designs. Note there is an entire MERC workshop on this topic also. As the question or the answer to the questions become more quantitative, correlational studies are more feasible. Hallmarks of correlational designs are that we are not assigning people to groups or interventions, and we don't have control groups. There is no randomization. We are looking at associations between and among variables for a group of people. It's quite common in medical education projects to use correlational designs. For example, we have lots of archived data within institutions about learners. From admissions, we know a lot of background data on our matriculated students. From the registrar, we know grades and other performance metrics. And from student affairs, we know what residency students match to. So using that data, we can ask questions such as relationships between, for example, where a student grew up, say urban versus rural location, and specialty choice. We might also have survey-based studies in which all students respond to a survey and we're describing results and looking for associations. For example, how scores on a depression inventory are related to self-reported use of mental health services. As topics evolve and the literature is more complete, experimental methods are feasible. Our two big choices are experimental and quasi-experimental designs. The main difference between the two is randomization. Typically in these designs, we have a specific intervention, and it is plausible to make hypotheses about a temporal relationship. That is, if we teach content in this way as opposed to another way, we can expect to see differences in outcomes. It's important that the intervention be a feasible and logical explanatory variable. And importantly, we have control over subjects and treatments. We are able to manipulate who gets what. So here are some popular quasi-experimental or non-randomized designs. In these next couple of the slides, the X refers to an intervention and the O refers to an observation or outcome. The simplest design is the one-shot case study. We have an intervention, we give it, generally to everyone, and we see what happens. So what's wrong with this? Well, maybe our intervention didn't cause the outcome we observe. In the absence of a control group, we can't know for sure. It's often logical that it did. For example, we teach anatomy to first-year students using an online curriculum, and then they take and most pass a test. They probably didn't know a lot before they started medical school, and so probably our curriculum made the difference. But while the design is logical, it's not robust. An alternative is to add a pretest. This helps rule out the possibility that the learners did not have the knowledge or skill or attitudes prior to the intervention, but still it's not a robust design because we can't rule out an alternative. Until a couple of decades ago, it was very common to see these designs in medical education. Now the standards are higher, and studies with these designs are often pilots or innovations. The key improvement to non-experimental designs is to add a control group. Practically, this may mean dividing the learners into two groups and giving the treatment to one group. Note subjects are not randomized. Learners fall into two groups based on a factor outside of your control, for example, scheduling. If learners take rotations by month, you might decide to run your intervention every other month. Alternatively, historical controls can be really persuasive as the types of learners we have do not change a lot from year to year. What this means practically is that you need to have your study all designed and your variables operationalized this year so that you can collect your outcome on this year's historical controls before you implement your intervention next year. And finally, we show some experimental designs. The chief difference is that you are randomizing something, usually subjects, to a treatment or control group. The design moves from simple to complex. The Solomon 4 design, which is almost never used in medical education, can be used when we are worried or concerned that exposure to a pretest may actually influence performance on the post-test. But sticking with the designs on the prior slide, with a strong control group or using one of the first two designs shown here, we have very robust study design. Experimental and quasi-experimental studies are a goal, but they are not without possible problems. Here we list potential threats to internal validity. There's a classic book written by Campbell and Stanley, which we reference at the end of these slides, that goes into depth on each of these threats. I'll mention just a couple here. History is one threat. This refers to accounting for and hopefully measuring how one's prior experience may influence the outcome. Thinking back to our early example with the airway simulator, experience with simulation was named as a covariate that may matter. Maturation is often a big deal in education. In fact, we work on short cycles, whether it is a single course or rotation or even an academic year. Our learners are changing fast as they are exposed to multiple learning experiences. What can we do? How can we design a study to support the claim that our intervention mattered and it wasn't simply maturation and accumulated knowledge? Selection bias is often an issue if we rely on volunteers, or if we have an extended observation period, we may experience loss of subjects or dropout. Similarly, if we are asking subjects to repeat a task or a survey on multiple occasions, prior experiences may influence later outcomes. In sum, internal validity has to do with how we design and carry out our study. External validity has to do with answering questions about generalizability of the findings. We start by asking, is the sample representative of the population? Can the study results and conclusions be generalized to the population? It's also important to ask if the subjects acted differently because they were subjects in the study. This is called the Hawthorne effect. Again, the references at the end of this presentation are useful for learning more about design in general and threats to internal and external validity specifically. So this is the end of section 4. Return to your worksheet and complete questions 13 and 14. Okay, IRB, writing and analyzing. In this brief final section, we want to give you pointers in moving forward. You will see there are 3 steps left in the research process, but you've already done the hardest parts. Now that your study is all designed, you will probably need to write an IRB application. Let's recall what research is. Research means a systematic investigation including research, development, testing, and evaluation to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. Institutions deal with medical education projects in many different ways. For example, at my institution, an important parameter is whether one might disseminate the results outside of the institution. Some IRBs are also developing new procedures to guide an investigator through deciding if the proposed work is quality improvement or research. Check with your IRB to make sure you know their expectations. Here are some of the issues that come up. Are the data that you're using normally or routinely already collected in your course, or will the data be collected specifically for your new study? Will the data be anonymous or will they be confidential? Will you use any type of identifier? Is there a plan to link multiple types of data, for example, attitude surveys, to performance metrics? And of course, do you need informed consent? And if you do, does it have to be written and signed? In the end, what kind of review will you pursue? Exempt, expedited, or full? Important questions that you certainly need to answer. And so now back to the process. So on to analyzing data. What is your plan for this? Some of us do our own analyses, but that's not the norm. Check with your analysts frequently as you design your study so that you can give them something at the end that they can work with. We have a MERC workshop for this topic too, data management and preparation for statistical consultation. So if you don't analyze your data, where will you find someone to work with you? Again, it's institution specific. Here are some places to look for. So within your department, we suggest you find colleagues who have done research before of similar scope and see where they found a data analyst. We also suggest you look within your medical school. What does the dean's office have to offer? Is there an educational research unit there? Perhaps a group of people who do assessment and evaluation. Within a larger university, it's often possible to find colleagues with analytic expertise in other places, for example, schools of education, public health, nursing, or educational support centers. Look around and try and build a team. And so here we are at the end, writing and reporting results. Please do this step. There's so many projects that get through all the prior steps. The data are collected, often even analyzed, and that's how it ends. And not surprisingly, we have a MERC workshop on this too. So pick a target outlet early in the process. Learn their style and format, and we list a bunch here. There's general medical education journals like Academic Medicine, Medical Education, Teaching and Learning in Medicine, and so on. We also suggest you know your meetings, like the AAMC Annual Learn, Serve, Leave meeting and the regional GEA Group on Educational Affairs meetings. There's also the Ottawa Conference, the Association for Medical Education meeting in Europe, AME, and others that are listed here. And some clinical journals are also very receptive to medical education work. We've had good luck with JAMA, JGIM, Family Medicine, and certainly in surgery, they have their own medical education journal. The point is that you have done work that makes a difference. It investigates important questions, check, as well as relevant, feasible, and interesting. You're going to connect your study to prior literature and theory, check. This is what happens through your literature review. You use an appropriate or even optimal research design and strong data analytic procedures, check. We've covered some of the design issues. And then you're going to disseminate your results. Don't let it stop here. So in closing, know yourself and what your barriers to writing will be. Do you need to join a writing group? Do you need to be accountable to deadlines? Are you more of a behavioralist and respond well to frequent rewards after small increments of work? How about a paragraph a week? We suggest you drop the idea that you need a large block of time to write. That rarely happens. Here are some ideas offered by colleagues. Create a project plan with specific tasks and deadlines. Find collaborators, mentors, and consultants. Search for funding if you need it. Protect time for research, but learn to be efficient and take advantage of small blocks of time. Keep a research journal and have fun. So that's it for this workshop. Here's some of the references we used. Here's a link for an evaluation. It's very helpful to us if you do it. It is anonymous. And for the final activity, please return to the worksheet and answer questions 15 to 18. You can post your worksheet if you'd like some feedback. I can give you some within the next week, most likely. Thanks again.